Philip Lee returning with a new episode of Civil War Chat. It's Sunday, the 15th of November. Just want to point out up here in the upper right, click on that notification bell and you will be notified every time I have a new episode. Today's purpose is to respond to an article in The Nation magazine this past June, written by a journalism professor at Washington and Lee University. And her objective was to state all the reasons that she felt the school should drop the Lee name from Washington and Lee. It's really a pretty aggressive letter, but let me get started with a response here. This past summer, a Washington and Lee journalism professor wrote an article for The Nation, concluding that her school should drop the name of Lee because he was, quote, a man who acted dishonorably throughout his entire life, close quote. Aside from the hyperbole concerning her summation of his entire life, it is fun to dismiss some of her complaints with equally exaggerated interpretations in the opposite direction. In the first paragraph, she complains of the symbols in the campus chapel that, quote, reek of the lies of the lost cause myth, close quote, that developed after the end of the war. And that it is amplified by the, quote, enduring stench, close quote, that comes from the buried, quote, bones of the slave-owning Lee family, close quote. But another visitor, for example, might want to honor the chapel with the Lee name for containing not the bones of the slave-owning Lee family, but the bones of the slave-emancipating Lee family. According to his son Robert, General Lee freed his slaves several years, well, he only had a few, and he freed them several years before the Civil War began. During most of his prior life, Lee was on military duty and had little use for slaves. Simultaneously, his wife had access to all the slaves she needed from her father, George Custis, who was a grandson of George Washington by marriage. And he owned over 100 slaves. Lee's situation prior to the Civil War was much like that of Ulysses Grant, who worked the slaves owned by his father-in-law. By the end of 1862, however, the Lee family did not own any slaves. The war had another 3 years to go. Last had been set free 3 years before the war ended, but that's not true of the Grant family. Similarly, the South's reverence for Lee was not a myth that developed after the Civil War, as implied by her lost cause allusion. No commander, North or South, was more beloved by his troops during the Civil War than was Robert E. Lee. To continue with more frank refutation of her remarks, consider her accusation that Lee's postbellum reputation as a, quote, proponent of reconciliation between the North and South, close quote, is a product of, quote, revisionist history and an effective PR machine, close quote. Well, that's a stretch requiring a bungee cord. Only 4 months after he surrendered his army, he wrote Washington College to accept their offer to make him president as follows, quote, I think it the duty of every citizen in the present condition of the country to do all in his power to aid the restoration of peace and harmony, and in no way to oppose the policy of the state or general, meaning federal, governments. Directed to that object, It is particularly incumbent on those charged with the instruction of the young to set them an example of submission to authority, close quote. She follows, this journalism professor, this W&L journalism professor, follows by alleging his most pernicious sin of fighting for a nation whose goal was to promote slavery. That accusation is an absurdity for two reasons. First, Lee made it clear that his first loyalty was to Virginia, his home state. Second, like the other three states of the Upper South, Virginia did not secede to promote slavery. She seceded only after President Lincoln called for an army to force the 7 states of the Lower South back into the Union against their will. He could have let them go in peace. He could have evacuated Fort Sumter before a bombardment. Let the 7 states go in peace. Virginia would have stayed. Virginia had warned that she believed, she had warned Lincoln that she believed coercion, as indicated by such a military adventure, was unconstitutional, and she would fight to prevent it. 73 years earlier, when they ratified the U.S. Constitution, Virginians pointedly reserved the right to withdraw from the new government, quote, whenever the powers granted unto it should be perverted to the injury or to their injury or oppression, close quote. Next, the prof adds that W&L must drop Lee's name, quote, as people rise up around the world to protest institutional racism, close quote. I don't contest the lawless uprisings and vandalism that we all saw last summer, but I require this journalism professor to document the validity of her premise. Consider in this election earlier this year, more blacks voted against the Democrat than in any election in memory, notwithstanding that the Democrat Party imagines anti-black racism to exist everywhere, and they appeal to stop it. It is hard for America to have systemic racism when all of her institutions, such as academia, the media, Hollywood, big tech, consumer-facing tech companies, the deep state, and even corporate America endorse Black Lives Matter and so-called diversity of gender and skin color. Meanwhile, the diversity of thought is practically non-existent in such institutions and is reflected in one way by the censorship of speakers who will defend Robert E. Lee. Show me an example of where Washington and Lee has permitted a speaker who will defend Robert E. Lee to speak to the student body. In fact, the only legally sanctioned racism in America today is affirmative action, which favors blacks over minorities such as Asians and Ashkenazi Jews, among others. That's not to say that America is free of racism. There is racism here. But institutional racism, that's hard to take. It's hard to accept when all the institutions are controlled by people who endorse so-called diversity and Black Lives Matter. The professor follows this with an accusation that Lee does not merit his reputation as an educator. She instead attributes W&L's reputation to, quote, the thousands of faculty, student, and staff that followed him, close quote. In her haste to applaud herself, she ignores the contributions from generations of Confederate veterans, their descendants, and others who endorsed the traditional values emphasized at Washington and Lee, that were planted and nurtured by General Lee. He even started the journalism school where she is employed. What is lacking is not contributions by General Lee, but gratitude on the part of this professor. Lee's name should also be dropped, she argues, because he was a racist and traitor. In truth, he was never convicted of treason, and even Confederate hostile historian Alan Guelzo, who will be speaking at WNL in a couple of months, admits that Lee would likely have won his day in court based upon his defense of being a Virginian first and an American second. As noted, the Lee family had earlier manumitted all of their slaves. Nonetheless, consider a Northerner like Lincoln, and consider that he must also be judged a racist based upon a number of quotes, including one stated during the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates. Quote, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about the social and political equality of the white and black races. And as much as there must be the position of superior to inferior, I am as much as any other man in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race," close quote. Eventually, the journalism prof spawns a straw man in her arguments by observing that Lee did not create WNL's honor system. No, like nearly all schools, Washington College had an honor system before Lee arrived, but it was practically defunct. The general transformed it by giving the students, instead of the administration, ownership of the honor pledge. The impact is reflected in his answer to a freshman student who arrived and asked him for a list of the rules for Washington College. Lee responded, "We have but one rule here, and it is that every student must be a gentleman," close quote. Encompassed in that one answer is that the students must be beyond courteous. They must never lie, cheat, or steal. Furthermore, it implies that all students should be ashamed if the pledge is not strictly followed by all of them. Next, this journalism professor accuses Lee of dishonorable panic in applying for amnesty in June 1865 under the terms announced by President Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson said, "Hey," he told the Southerners, "if you want amnesty, here are the terms of you have to apply under." And as a general in the Army, Lee's terms were specific. Well, she asserts that Lee's application was a panic response to a treason indictment of him a week or so earlier. Although he first verified with General Grant that the Appomattox surrender terms immunized him from government, quote, disturbance, close quote, the prof implies that he was using a good old boys network, no doubt unavailable to women like her, to evade conviction because both Grant and Lee were West Point graduates. In reality, Lee wanted to set an example of reconciliation for other Confederate soldiers, as exemplified by the following story. Amnesty required a new allegiance oath. Friction resulted from the efforts to ram the oath down everybody's throat at once. A Captain George Wise, W-I-S-E, Wise, was called before the provost to take the oath. "Why must I take it?" he asked. "My parole covers the ground. I will not." "You fought under General Lee, did you not?" asked the provost. "Yes, and I surrendered with him and gave my parole. To require this oath of me is to put an indignity upon me and my general. I will make a bargain with you, Captain. Consult General Lee and abide by his decision. The captain went to the Lee residence and told the general where he was received by the general, and told him, "They want me to take this thing, General," said the captain, extending a copy of the oath. "My parole covers it. I don't think it should be required of me. What do you advise?" Close quote. Yeah. Lee answered, "I would advise you to take it. It is absurd that it should be required of my soldiers, for as you say, General Grant's Appomattox parole covers it. Nevertheless, take it, I should say." "General, I feel this is a submission to indignity. If I must continue to swear the same thing over at every street corner, I will seek another country where I can at least preserve my self-respect." After a moment's silence, General Lee said quietly, "Do not leave Virginia. Our country needs her young men now." When the captain told Henry A. Wise, A was the middle initial, Wise again, the last name, W-I-S-E. When he told Henry Wise that he had taken the oath, the ex-governor shouted, "You have disgraced the family." "But General Lee advised me to do it." "Oh, well, that alters the case. Whatever General Lee says is all right. I don't care what it is." Beyond that story, however, Lee demonstrated his courage when prosecutors were preparing a treason case against Confederate President Jefferson Davis. When questioning the general, they asked a series of questions that attempted to get Lee to admit that his actions, his military actions in the field, were taken at the bidding of President Davis. There was a hint there that if he answered those questions in the affirmative, he could escape personal prosecution. Lee declined to take the bait. He replied, quote, "I am responsible for what I did, and I cannot recall now any important movement I made, which I would not have made had I acted entirely on my own responsibility." Close quote. Finally, I'll conclude with a technique that a Princeton professor has been using, and which might be applied in this instance with good effect to this W&L journalism teacher. According to Princeton law professor Robert George, nearly all of his students declare that they would have been abolitionists had they lived in the South before the Civil War and during the Civil War. But he shows that only the tiniest fraction of them, or of any of us, would have spoken out against slavery or lifted a finger to free the slaves. Most of them, and us, would have gone along. Many would have supported the slave system and happily benefited from it. Here's how Professor George makes his point. He tells the students that he will credit their abolitionist claims if they can show that in leading their present lives, they have stood up for the rights of unpopular victims of injustice. And where they have done so, knowing one, they would be loathed and ridiculed by powerful individuals and institutions in our society. And two, they would be abandoned by many of their friends. And three, they would be shouted down with vile names. And four, they would be denied valuable professional opportunities as a result of their moral witnessing. And five, they might even lose their jobs after such witnessing. After they ponder those 5 points, students realize they would not likely have been abolitionist. In short, he challenged the students to show where they have, at the risk to themselves and their futures, stood up for a cause that is unpopular within the elite sectors of today's society. It's a revealing challenge for students, but would be much more illuminating if applied to academic historians and teachers such as the W&L journalism professor who wrote the critical article for The Nation in June. It evokes, for the others at W&L who endure this calumny, whatever the proper pronunciation is for it, in silence. They endure this criticism of Lee in silence because of the ancient wisdom. Courage is the rarest of virtues, close quote. What I think this professor demonstrates, and the entire movement to take Lee out of the school's name, is encapsulated in another saying, another expression. I think it comes from another historian. Criticizing and condemning others is an indirect way of praising ourselves, close quote. I'd like to end with a couple of things. This book I wrote on President Grant's failed presidency, U.S. Grant's failed presidency, it's critical. And it's partly because so many of the biographies that have been written about him in the last 25 years are just hagiographies. But what he did was, and he had a big role in the crime of Reconstruction. But when I wrote this, it was critical. And there were many times when I had to ask myself, am I being fair? This man is, he's been dead for a long time. He can't defend himself against my accusations. Am I really being fair? I don't think that article in The Nation, the author of that article in The Nation, ever considered that. The second thing I want to mention is my book, The Confederacy at Flood Tide, which has a lot in it about Lee because it covers June of 1862 to December of 1862, when the Confederacy had its best chance to win the Civil War. Both books are available at Amazon. This one is available at all bookstores. You can also buy signed copies from me. Just email me, Phil_Lee, L-E-I-G-H. And this book would be $31 for a signed copy. And if you're in the United States, I will cover the postage. And this one would be $23 for a signed copy. At Amazon, this one's 20 and this one is 28. So for me, Phil Lee, and Civil War Chat, thank you for watching. Again, click on the bell in the upper right so that you'll be notified of my future shows. Thanks for watching.